Winter 1944. The wind swept across the Kansas plains, carrying the scent of dry earth and diesel. Inside a converted barracks at Camp Concordia, the sound of war was replaced by the scrape of pencils on paper. Dozens of German soldiers sat in rows at makeshift desks, their field gray uniforms now faded to pale green. Instead of rifles, they held notebooks. Instead of orders, they listened to lessons. At the front of the room, an American sergeant in khaki leaned over a chalkboard filled with English words: freedom, justice, citizen. His voice was steady, patient, almost academic. A few men mouthed the words quietly, rolling unfamiliar syllables through their accents. Others copied formulas from a math lecture, pausing to ask questions in halting English. In one corner, a young lieutenant, once an artillery officer near Tobruk, sketched diagrams of crop rotation from an agriculture class. He paused, staring at the word soil as if it carried new meaning. Outside, the guard tower stood silent under frost. The men inside were still prisoners, but in that cold wooden classroom something else had begun, a kind of victory measured not in battles, but in understanding. And to know how such a thing could exist, we must go back to the moment America decided to teach its enemies. By late 1943, the tide of the Second World War had turned. Across the deserts of North Africa, German and Italian forces were falling into Allied hands by the tens of thousands. In Tunisia alone, more than 250,000 Axis soldiers surrendered in what became one of the largest mass capitulations in modern history. The United States, only recently a full participant in the war, suddenly faced a challenge no one had anticipated: what to do with an army of enemy prisoners on foreign soil. Between 1943 and 1945, over 425,000 German POWs would be shipped across the Atlantic to the United States, more than any other Axis nationality. They arrived quietly, aboard Liberty ships that had carried ammunition and supplies to the European front, and now returned laden with captives instead of cargo. The voyages were long and uneasy, but far less brutal than many had expected. Geneva Convention rules guaranteed fair treatment, and the War Department was determined that America would uphold them, not simply as policy, but as principle. When the first groups landed in Norfolk, Boston, and New Orleans, they were met not by jeering crowds, but by order and efficiency. Trucks rolled them inland to sprawling compounds built hastily across the Midwest and South, from the pine forests of Louisiana to the wheat fields of Kansas and the prairies of Nebraska. These were not prisons in the conventional sense. They were small towns behind wire: kitchens, infirmaries, chapels, recreation fields, even libraries. Each camp was governed under strict military code. Guards patrolled with discipline but not cruelty. The aim was containment, not punishment. Food matched the caloric intake of American troops. Wages were paid in camp scrip. Letters to families were permitted through the International Red Cross. For many German soldiers, it was the first time in years they ate without fear of hunger. But something else happened inside those fences. Something more subtle, and ultimately more transformative. When the War Department established the Prisoner of War Division under the Provost Marshal General's office, it faced an unusual dilemma. The United States had captured not only ordinary soldiers, but thousands of men who had lived and breathed Nazi ideology. Many were young, educated, and deeply indoctrinated. If the camps became idle, resentment would fester. If the prisoners were humiliated, propaganda would feed on the injustice. So Washington adopted an approach grounded in both law and psychology: intellectual containment. The idea was to keep the prisoners occupied, engaged, and quietly reoriented. The Geneva Convention's Article 17 allowed for the intellectual and moral well-being of prisoners, including access to books and instruction. American officials took that clause literally. In 1944, under the direction of General B.M. Bryan and a newly created Special Projects Division, they began to develop educational programs for German prisoners. Not propaganda lectures, but genuine courses modeled on American academic standards. The logic was clear. Germany's defeat was certain. Its moral reconstruction would follow. If these men would one day return to rebuild their homeland, then their exposure to democracy, fair discipline, and free inquiry might sow the seeds of a different Germany. But implementing that vision was anything but simple. At first, The War Department allowed small voluntary classes organized by the prisoners themselves. Many German officers were former teachers, engineers, or scientists, and they quickly formed study groups, teaching mathematics, literature, and even philosophy in their native tongue. The Americans, surprised by the level of organization, began providing materials: notebooks, chalk, dictionaries, and textbooks requisitioned from nearby universities. Camp libraries expanded rapidly. By 1944, the U.S. had distributed over 1 million books across its POW network. They came from university donations and civilian relief groups, Shakespeare, Goethe, textbooks on chemistry and agriculture, even American novels like Of Mice and Men. Some of the German prisoners were astonished. Back home, much of their education had been filtered through censorship and ideology.
Here in enemy territory, they were allowed, even encouraged, to read freely.
To discuss, to question. For the American officers in charge, this was deliberate. Re-education, as it was sometimes called, was never framed as conversion. It was exposure. The plan was to let democratic values speak through conduct, not coercion. Among the more than 500 main and branch camps, Camp Concordia in Kansas emerged as one of the most remarkable. Located among vast farmlands, it housed roughly 4,000 German prisoners, many from North Africa and Italy. The camp itself resembled a small rural town: 300 barracks, a hospital, mess halls, a recreation center, and a theater. But what set Concordia apart was its atmosphere. Its commandant, Colonel John B. Corder, believed discipline could coexist with respect. Guards were trained not to provoke or insult. Prisoners were addressed by rank. And when German educators within the camp proposed a structured academic program, Corder gave his approval. By mid-1944, the camp's schoolhouse, once a warehouse, had been transformed. Blackboards lined the walls, desks were built from scrap wood, and a schedule was posted. English in the morning, mathematics in the afternoon, agricultural science in the evening. Attendance was voluntary, but soon the classrooms were full. For the Germans, it was surreal. They had expected humiliation. Instead, they found opportunity. Some compared it to attending a university in exile. Others saw irony in being taught by the very nation they had been taught to despise. As the program expanded, so did its reach. The U.S. Army began recruiting civilian professors and educators, many with degrees in pedagogy, agriculture, and the humanities, to teach in camps. They wore uniforms but carried textbooks instead of rifles. The idea was simple. If democracy was to be understood, it had to be lived. Lectures covered not just English grammar or farm science, but the foundations of the American political system. There were discussions on the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the history of free elections, and the principles of debate. Nothing was forced. Participation was always voluntary. But for the prisoners who joined, the experience was transformative. Some German officers who had once recited oaths to Hitler now found themselves analyzing the Federalist Papers. Young conscripts who had known only orders and obedience now debated ethics and economics. The change was not immediate, but it was genuine. The Americans kept careful records. At Camp Concordia alone, more than 300 formal courses were offered, covering subjects from literature to mechanical engineering. Tests were administered, grades recorded, and certificates issued, all within the framework of Geneva compliance. Outside the fences, local communities were equally astonished. Farmers who hired POWs for field labor noticed their discipline and curiosity. Many of the Germans asked questions about crop yields, soil quality, and irrigation methods, topics they later studied formally in class. One Kansas farmer reportedly remarked, "They came to plow the fields, and they left knowing how to own one." Meanwhile, newspapers across the Midwest published stories about German classrooms behind barbed wire. Some citizens questioned the generosity. Why educate the enemy? But the government stood firm. Education, it argued, was cheaper and more effective than resentment. It kept the camp stable and prevented violence. And in the long run, it might rebuild Europe more efficiently than punishment ever could. By 1945, the War Department's Intellectual Welfare Initiative had expanded to more than 400 camps, reaching over 100,000 prisoners. The program included correspondence courses, technical training, and even art exhibitions. A monthly POW magazine, Der Ruf, the Call, was published under supervision, written by German prisoners who advocated democratic ideals and denounced Nazi dogma. It was unlike anything the world had seen. A university behind wire. For many German POWs, the experience became their first encounter with freedom, not in body but in mind. They began to question not just what they had fought for, but why. One prisoner later wrote in his memoir, "The Americans did not try to make us love them. They simply treated us as men capable of thought." That was the beginning of our education. The irony was not lost on the educators either. In those wooden classrooms, America was teaching democracy to the very men who had sought to destroy it. Not through lectures about ideology, but through the quiet daily practice of fairness, equality, and self-control. For every chalkboard lesson and English exercise, there was an unspoken message. That power, when tempered by decency, could reform even the minds of the defeated. And as the winter of 1944 gave way to spring, the experiment deepened. What had begun as small study groups soon evolved into a full-fledged academic institution, with syllabi, faculty, and examinations recognized by American universities. That was when Camp Concordia became something far more than a prison. It became a campus, and that transformation, unprecedented in the history of warfare, would change both the prisoners and the nation that had captured them. The early months of 1945, the atmosphere inside Camp Concordia no longer resembled that of a prison. The watchtower still stood, and guards still patrolled the perimeters, but within the fences a different kind of order had taken root, one built on books, pencils, and ideas. What had started as casual study groups had grown into a structured academic environment, something the prisoners themselves began calling die Lageruniversität, the camp university. To an outsider, it was almost impossible to reconcile. The same men who had once manned artillery pieces and panzer divisions now sat hunched over textbooks in the soft light of kerosene lamps. Their faces, once hardened by war, softened into concentration. Lessons in grammar, algebra, and agriculture replaced drills and roll calls. The discipline was the same, but its purpose had shifted. The prisoners were not compelled to attend classes. Yet the demand quickly exceeded capacity. Each morning before the flag rose, hundreds gathered outside the makeshift classrooms, barracks retrofitted with chalkboards, maps, and benches cut from salvaged lumber. A small bell signaled the start of lessons. The subjects were broad and ambitious. English, economics, history, chemistry, mathematics, forestry, even philosophy. A special emphasis was placed on practical knowledge, agriculture, and engineering, disciplines that could be applied to rebuilding post-war Germany. The U.S. Army supplied materials. Professors from Kansas State University and nearby colleges volunteered or were commissioned to teach. The professors wore khaki uniforms but carried themselves like academics, soft-spoken, patient, intent on clarity rather than command. Among the German prisoners were men of remarkable intellect. Captured officers included engineers from Hamburg, teachers from Munich, and one former lecturer in physics from Heidelberg. They were astonished by the American willingness to let them teach. The camp's educational program soon became a cooperative effort. Germans teaching Germans, under American oversight. A prisoner named Dr. Heinrich Nord, who had been an agricultural researcher before the war, organized lectures on soil science and crop management. His blackboard diagrams were meticulous, his handwriting elegant, his tone exacting. American officers often attended his classes to observe, not out of suspicion, but out of respect. Another prisoner, Karl Meissner, a former high school teacher from Bremen, led English language discussion groups using American newspapers provided by the Red Cross. The students dissected articles about politics, sports, and even jazz music. Through language, they were exposed to the rhythm of democratic thought, the unfiltered debates, the editorials, the freedom to disagree. For the prisoners, it was both disorienting and intoxicating. They had grown up under a system where dissent was treason and where truth was delivered, not discovered. Now they were being taught that argument, respectful, reasoned argument, was the foundation of progress. one former prisoner later recalled in his memoir. In those classrooms, we discovered a weapon more powerful than any we had carried, the power to think without fear. To the Americans running the camps, this quiet intellectual revival was both strategic and moral. Colonel Corder believed that teaching German soldiers the values of inquiry and responsibility would produce citizens less likely to repeat the errors of dictatorship. If they learn to govern their minds, he once remarked to a visiting officer, they'll learn to govern their country. But for many guards and locals, the sight remained surreal. Farmers from nearby Kansas towns, accustomed to seeing prisoners as potential threats, now watched them carry notebooks to class and recite English verbs while walking to work details. One local newspaper published a photograph of POWs seated at wooden desks under the headline, "Nazis Study Democracy." Reactions were mixed. Some readers were proud, evidence, they said, that America practiced the ideals it preached. Others were skeptical. Letters poured into the War Department. Why should we educate the enemy while our own sons die overseas? The answer came from Washington with quiet conviction. The war was being fought not only to defeat Germany's armies, but to defeat its ideas. Re-education was not charity, it was strategy. Every mind liberated from totalitarianism was a future ally against it. Inside the camps, the transformation went deeper than academics. With guidance from the Special Projects Division, the prisoners began producing their own literature. At Camp Concordia and other large facilities, German-language newsletters circulated weekly, written, edited, and illustrated by POWs. The articles covered camp news, agriculture tips, poems, and occasionally philosophical essays on democracy and ethics. One publication, Der Ruf, The Call, became the most famous. It began as a small camp paper, but evolved into a monthly magazine circulated among POW camps nationwide. Its editors, former journalists and intellectuals, promoted a tone of introspection. They questioned nationalism, reflected on guilt, and urged readers to envision a future Germany built on cooperation rather than conquest. In its first issue, the editors wrote, "We are not told what to think, but we are learning how to think again." The Americans allowed its publication, carefully monitoring for subversion but rarely censoring. They understood that genuine moral change could not be dictated. It had to arise from within. Meanwhile, daily life in the camp blended study with routine. After morning classes, prisoners worked in surrounding farmlands under contract with local farmers, harvesting wheat, tending livestock, and repairing machinery. Their wages, a few cents a day in camp credits, could be spent at the commissary or saved for repatriation. Evenings often turned into cultural gatherings. The camp theater hosted lectures, concerts, and occasional debates between prisoners and American staff. A small orchestra, formed from captured military musicians, played Bach and Beethoven under the desert stars. Sometimes the Americans joined, bringing their instruments from town, an unlikely harmony between former enemies. Education extended beyond the classroom. Every polite exchange, every collaborative task became part of the unspoken curriculum of democracy. The prisoners began mirroring their guards' behavior, using please and thank you, addressing officers by title, standing in line patiently. Manners, discipline, and mutual respect merged into a kind of silent pedagogy. Not all prisoners accepted it. Some die-hard Nazis viewed the classes as betrayal and accused fellow soldiers of weakness. They whispered about soft Americans and traitors in disguise. But as Germany's collapse became undeniable, even the most devout ideologues grew quiet. The younger men, especially, gravitated toward the classrooms. Many had been teenagers when drafted, their education interrupted by war. For them, these lessons were a lifeline to a future beyond rubble and loss. Some began writing letters to their families in Germany describing their studies. "I am learning English and agriculture. The Americans are strange and polite, confident, patient. It feels as if they are training us not as enemies but as neighbors." Such letters were reviewed by censors but often allowed through. The War Department recognized their potential value. Small ripples of goodwill carried across the Atlantic. Among the American instructors, there was an unspoken sense that history was being written quietly, in chalk dust rather than gunpowder. Many had come from universities suspended by war. Now in khaki and fatigue caps, They found themselves teaching men who had once sworn to destroy their homeland. The irony was heavy, but so was the hope. In 1945, the War Department formally integrated these efforts into an official educational policy. It established the Prisoner of War Education and Training Branch, directing that all large camps provide opportunities for voluntary learning. Each program was cataloged, standardized, and reviewed. At Camp Concordia, the system evolved into a near-university structure. Courses had syllabi, attendance records, and exams. Instructors, both German and American, held academic titles: doesn't professor, assistant instructor. Certificates were printed on plain paper but bore the camp seal. Some were later recognized by German universities after the war. In one remarkable development, Kansas State University extended informal accreditation to select coursework in agriculture and mechanics, allowing prisoners to earn credits transferable upon their return to civilian life. For many, this was their first formal academic achievement. The cultural impact was profound. Within the barbed wire, hierarchies began to shift. Officers and enlisted men sat side by side in class, their ranks suspended by curiosity. Shared study replaced strict obedience. The result was subtle but revolutionary. Equality in learning became a rehearsal for equality in society. A captured German engineer, reflecting decades later, said, "In that classroom, I first called a sergeant by his first name. It was the smallest act of democracy I had ever known." That shift, invisible to outsiders, was precisely what the Americans hoped for. They had learned from the mistakes of the post-World War I settlement, where humiliation bred hatred. This time they sought conversion through confidence, to replace bitterness with comprehension. By late 1945, as the war in Europe ended, the camps hummed with a strange mix of anticipation and melancholy. News of Germany's surrender arrived through the same radios used for English lessons. Some prisoners wept. Others sat in silence. A few asked to stay longer, not out of fear but because the camp, with its order and opportunity, felt safer than the chaos awaiting them at home. American officers understood. The re-education program was not a miracle, but it was a beginning. Many of the prisoners who attended classes later became interpreters, agricultural specialists, and teachers in post-war Germany. Their exposure to American civility and self-discipline reshaped how they understood leadership and citizenship. Colonel Corder wrote in his final report from Concordia, "We have given them not a doctrine, but an example. If they carry home even a fragment of what they have seen, it will be worth more than any victory won by force." Beyond Kansas, the model spread. At Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Swift in Texas, and Camp Hearn in Oklahoma, similar programs flourished. By the end of the war, the United States had built not just prison camps, but classrooms across its heartland, places where young German soldiers met the better angels of the nation that had defeated them. For the men inside, the experience left marks far deeper than any wound of battle. Years later, when historians asked former prisoners what they remembered most about captivity, few spoke of fences or guards. They spoke, instead of the lessons, of teachers who treated them with dignity, of libraries filled with American books, of evenings when enemies shared conversation rather than conflict. One former POW, interviewed in 1970, said simply, "In those classes, we learned that democracy is not an idea, it is behavior, and that realization, born behind barbed wire in the quiet heart of America, would soon become the turning point of everything that followed." Because what began as education within captivity was about to become education for freedom. The spring of 1945 arrived like a quiet revelation across the Midwest. The war in Europe was ending, though the camps remained full. Thousands of German soldiers still waited for repatriation, uncertain what kind of Germany they would return to. For many, their homeland was little more than a memory. Cities reduced to ash, families scattered, a government dissolved. But behind the barbed wire of America's prisoner of war camps, another kind of rebuilding had already begun. At Camp Concordia, the wooden barracks once used for roll call were now classrooms. The chalkboards bore algebraic formulas, grammar lessons, and notes on American civics. Outside, the Kansas wind rattled the tin roofs. Inside, history was being rewritten, not by force but by choice. The transformation reached its peak when the War Department approved the formalization of the Educational Initiative. What had begun as an experiment under the Special Projects Division was now recognized as a structured academic system. In April 1945, officials authorized the creation of what some called the University of the POW camp. It wasn't propaganda, it was pedagogy, sanctioned by the U.S. government and supervised by civilian academics drawn from universities across the nation. Colonel John Corder, the commandant at Camp Concordia, received the telegram with quiet pride. His reports had reached Washington, and now his camp would serve as one of the program's models. Within weeks, new materials arrived: textbooks in English, agriculture manuals from Kansas State College, mathematics guides, and even laboratory equipment. Professors from regional universities were invited to lecture, their classrooms filled not with American youth, but with uniformed German soldiers, still technically enemies of the United States. One of the first accredited classes was Fundamentals of Agriculture. The course covered crop rotation, soil enrichment, pest control, and livestock management. The irony was sharp. Men once trained to destroy now studied how to cultivate. The American instructor, a quiet agronomist named Lieutenant George Hill, recalled the first session vividly. They listened as if every word mattered. He later said, "I realized these men weren't just learning about farming, they were learning about rebuilding." By the end of the term, the class had produced a small demonstration plot behind the barracks, transforming a patch of Kansas soil into orderly rows of wheat and corn. It became a living symbol of renewal. Prisoners took turns tending it, writing reports on irrigation and yield patterns. The camp newspaper featured photographs of smiling men standing beside the crops, proof that knowledge could grow even within confinement. Alongside the agricultural programs came courses in English, mathematics, economics, and history. Attendance surged. Guards and instructors were astonished at the prisoners' discipline. Many attended 3 classes a day, then spent their evenings studying by candlelight. The War Department had expected modest participation. Instead, the enthusiasm was overwhelming. Camps began to establish academic committees, composed of both German instructors and American supervisors. Syllabi were written in English and German, lessons structured like those at civilian universities. Exams were administered, graded, and archived. In a report dated June 1945, one American education officer wrote, "The academic seriousness of these men would humble many of our own students. They seek not degrees but direction." Some prisoners even began submitting written theses. Topics ranged from the economics of post-war reconstruction to the role of education in preventing totalitarianism. These essays were reviewed by American academics, who provided feedback and commentary. For the first time, German officers and enlisted men were evaluated not by rank but by reasoning. Their worth was measured not in obedience but in thought. A particularly striking moment came in late May, when Camp Concordia hosted an academic convocation, a graduation ceremony of sorts. The event took place in the camp theater, its walls still adorned with faded military posters. Rows of wooden chairs were arranged before a makeshift stage. At the center stood a lectern draped in both the American and Red Cross flags. Colonel Corder addressed the audience, his voice steady, his tone formal. "These men have proven," he said, "that even in captivity the mind need not be bound." As he spoke, guards and prisoners alike stood at attention. There were no rifles, no salutes, only applause. Certificates were distributed, printed on standard Army stationery but bearing the proud seal of the camp. Each one carried a quiet dignity. For the recipients, it was not just a document, it was a promise that they might return home as something more than soldiers. Yet the true climax of this story was not a single event, but a collective realization, a moment when both the captors and the captured understood what was happening. The German prisoners had come expecting hostility. Instead, they found structure, discipline, and trust. The Americans, for their part, discovered that the ideals they fought for, freedom, education, self-determination, were not abstract values, but living forces that could transform even those who once opposed them. For many of the Germans, this awakening was deeply personal. Letters from prisoners during this time capture a rare tone of humility and awe. One, written by a 27-year-old officer named Otto Kruger, survives in an archive in Munich. "The Americans teach us not to hate, but to think." They trust us with books and pens. They believe we can become something else. I am beginning to believe it too. Another from Heinrich Lutz, a captured Luftwaffe mechanic, reads, "We are treated like men, not like animals. They make us study democracy, not because they force it, but because they live it." These words, written behind barbed wire, would later resonate across post-war Germany. The Americans had always understood the psychological stakes. The lessons taught at Camp Concordia and other camps were not meant to erase national pride, but to redefine it. Where Nazism had equated pride with domination, the new curriculum suggested that pride could come from productivity, knowledge, and self-control. A key figure in this transformation was Major Edward Davison, a poet and academic from the University of Colorado, who directed the Army's Special Projects Division. Davison had once taught literature before the war. Now he oversaw the intellectual re-education of an entire generation of captured Germans. His belief was simple yet radical. We cannot beat fascism with bullets alone. We must replace it with thought. Davison's team curated the reading lists for the camps, balancing German classics with translated American works. Prisoners studied Goethe alongside Lincoln's speeches, read Schiller beside Jefferson's letters. Through these juxtapositions, they discovered common ground: the universality of freedom and human dignity. As the program matured, its effects rippled outward. The War Department, astonished by reports from the field, began treating the re-education project as a model for post-war occupation policy. The same principles that worked within barbed wire, education, respect, opportunity, would later shape the Allied denazification efforts in Germany itself. In a memorandum circulated in August 1945, an American officer wrote, "The most successful conversion of former enemies has not been through force but through fairness. Our camps have become the first laboratories of democracy." Indeed, by the end of the year, the United States had effectively turned parts of its prison network into training grounds for future teachers, engineers, and administrators. Many of the POW graduates would later work in Germany's reconstruction efforts, citing their experiences in America as pivotal. Still, not all were convinced. Some American soldiers remained uneasy about the idea of teaching Nazis. A few politicians criticized the expense of maintaining educational programs for prisoners while U.S. veterans struggled to return home. But the officers who had witnessed the transformation firsthand defended it fiercely. Colonel Corder, when asked about the criticism, simply said, "We are not teaching them to be Americans. We are teaching them to be human again." His words captured the moral core of the project. The classrooms, the textbooks, the patient instructors, all were extensions of an idea far older than the war: that the mind, once freed from fear, could not be easily enslaved again. One of the final milestones came in the autumn of 1945, as repatriation began. Ships waited in ports from New York to New Orleans, their decks crowded with men in faded uniforms, their futures uncertain. Before departure, each prisoner received a brief exit interview. Many were asked what they had learned in captivity. Their answers were quiet, reflective: respect, discipline, freedom of thought. Some requested to take their textbooks home: English grammars, agricultural manuals, or small notebooks filled with class notes. A few carried certificates from Camp Concordia, carefully folded in their pockets. To the guards, they looked like souvenirs. To the men who held them, they were proof of transformation. On the final day of departures, as trucks lined up by the gate, several prisoners gathered to thank their instructors. They offered handshakes, handwritten notes, and small carved wooden gifts, pieces of the barracks reshaped into gestures of gratitude. An American sergeant, watching them leave, later wrote in his diary, "They came as enemies and left as students. Maybe that's what victory really looks like." When the last transports rolled out of Camp Concordia, the classrooms were empty once more. Chalkboards still bore half-erased equations. Desks were stacked neatly in corners. Outside, the wheat field planted by the agricultural students swayed in the wind, ready for harvest. It was a quiet, almost poetic end. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. But inside these camps, the first sparks of a new Germany had already been lit. Men who had once marched under the swastika now carried notebooks filled with English words and democratic ideas. In the months and years that followed, historians would look back on America's POW education program as one of the most unexpected successes of the war. a moral victory achieved not through punishment, but through patience. For the prisoners who experienced it, it was something even simpler, a restoration of dignity. And for the Americans who led it, it was proof that democracy's strength was not in its armies, but in its ability to teach even its enemies the meaning of freedom. That realization, born in classrooms under guard towers, would shape everything that came after, because what happened next, when these men returned home to a broken Germany, would show just how powerful an idea could be when carried across an ocean, not in chains but in memory. When the war ended in Europe in May 1945, the world fell into an uneasy silence. Cities lay in ruins. Empires had collapsed. In Germany, entire generations wandered through a landscape of ashes and disbelief. But far from the ruins, behind the fences of American camps scattered across the Midwest and South, something different had taken root, something that would quietly re-enter Germany and change it from within. The first German POWs began their repatriation in late 1945. For months, the process moved slowly, regulated by transport schedules, diplomatic delays, and post-war uncertainty. The men who boarded those ships were not the same soldiers who had been captured in North Africa or Sicily 2 years earlier. They carried notebooks instead of weapons, dictionaries instead of orders, and a memory that would shape their lives long after they crossed the Atlantic. The memory of what it felt like to be treated as a man, not a machine. At Camp Concordia, the departures began in October. Each morning, names were read aloud as trucks idled near the gates. Prisoners lined up in their patched uniforms, carrying small duffel bags and the faint unease of men leaving behind something unexpectedly meaningful. Among them were hundreds of students from the camp's university program, men who had learned English, studied civics, and written essays on democracy while still technically prisoners of war. Many of them requested permission to take their study materials home. The guards obliged. Dictionaries, agriculture manuals, and math textbooks disappeared into their bags. Some even carried certificates signed by Colonel John Corder, a modest piece of paper that would one day open doors in the universities of a reconstructed Germany. The first stop for many was the port city of Le Havre, France, where ships waited to take them home. The journey was long, the future uncertain. They knew only fragments of what awaited them. A defeated nation divided by occupation zones, cities without roofs, families surviving on meager rations. And yet, those who disembarked onto German soil in 1946 brought something that could not be measured in weight or counted in cargo: an education. In interviews decades later, former prisoners often described the psychological shock of returning. They came from the order, cleanliness, and respect of American camps into a Germany that felt unrecognizable. The regime that had defined their youth was gone. Authority itself had collapsed. But the values they had glimpsed in America, fairness, rationality, open discussion, gave them an inner framework. One former Concordia student, Heinrich Müller, later became a schoolteacher in Bavaria. In his memoirs he wrote, "When I came home, I found my town destroyed, my country ashamed, my generation lost. But I remembered something, that I had seen men govern with decency. It became my compass." The ripple effect spread quietly, often unnoticed. In 1946 and 1947, American occupation officials began noticing an unusual phenomenon. Among the German population, returning POWs, especially those held in the United States, displayed greater openness to democratic principles and civic responsibility than those released from Soviet or French custody. The difference was striking. Men who had studied under the American re-education programs organized reading groups, community farms, and discussion circles. In rural areas, they helped modernize agricultural practices using the methods they had learned from American manuals. In cities, they volunteered in schools or youth clubs. One U.S. Army report from 1947, compiled by the Office of Military Government for Germany, observed, "The influence of American-held POWs upon local civic organization and reconstruction efforts is disproportionately high. Their behavior reflects both discipline and initiative, likely products of educational exposure during captivity." At the same time, German universities began reinstating pre-war academic institutions. Many former prisoners sought admission using certificates earned in U.S. camps as evidence of their studies. Kansas State University and the University of Wisconsin confirmed in correspondence with German authorities that the courses taught in POW camps had met legitimate academic standards. This educational bridge created unexpected human connections between former enemies. American professors who had once taught behind barbed wire received letters of gratitude from Germany. Some included photographs of rebuilt classrooms or new schools. One letter from a former Concordia prisoner read, "The seed you planted has taken root in German soil. We teach now what we learned from you, that freedom is not granted but practiced." It was a poetic symmetry. The men who had once studied democracy under guard now became its quiet teachers in a shattered nation. Not all found their transition easy. Many returned to towns where suspicion lingered, where association with anything American was frowned upon in the early post-war confusion. Some were accused of being softened by captivity or betraying German pride, but most endured, certain that what they had seen in the camps, fairness, equality, curiosity, and was worth preserving. In West Germany, as new political and educational institutions emerged under Allied supervision, these men formed a kind of moral backbone for Reconstruction. They became teachers, agricultural advisors, journalists, engineers, and administrators. The Landwirtschaftsschulen, regional agricultural colleges, established in the late 1940s, included several alumni of American POW programs as early faculty members. One historian later called them the silent reformers, men whose understanding of democracy had been shaped not by ideology, but by experience. The contrast between their fate and that of prisoners held in Soviet camps could not have been more profound. In the East, hundreds of thousands of German POWs languished in brutal conditions: starvation, forced labor, indoctrination. Those who survived returned home years later, hardened and suspicious. Their accounts of captivity were filled with bitterness and trauma. In the West, the returning POWs carried a different story, one of respect, discipline, and humanity even amid defeat. This divergence subtly influenced the cultural and political tone of post-war Germany. Western zones of occupation, particularly under American administration, saw faster integration of democratic principles, partly because the returning soldiers had already glimpsed them in practice. A 1948 report from the U.S. Information Control Division noted, "Former prisoners educated in U.S. camps have shown remarkable adaptability to civic structures, demonstrating leadership in municipal reform and public education." This was not an accident. It was the result of a deliberate, patient experiment, one that had replaced punishment with pedagogy. Back in the United States, the POW camps were dismantled quietly. By 1947, most barracks had been sold off or converted into civilian housing. Camp Concordia's buildings were auctioned, its wooden classrooms disassembled, its fields returned to farming. Today only fragments remain, the faint outline of foundations, a weathered guard tower, and the remains of a theater where once the first academic convocation of prisoners had taken place. Yet the memory of what had happened there survived, in letters, memoirs, and the archives of the War Department. Historians would later call it one of the most successful humanitarian undertakings of the war. For the American officers who had overseen it, the legacy was personal. Many had returned to civilian life, resuming careers in education. Some went on to teach at universities, others to write about their experiences. Colonel Corder, the commandant of Camp Concordia, died in 1956, but his correspondence reveals a man who never saw his work as mere duty. In one letter, written shortly after the camp's closure, he reflected, "We built no monuments, but perhaps we planted a few trees in the desert of the human mind. They may take years to grow, but they will outlast the barbed wire." In Germany, those trees did grow. When the Federal Republic of Germany was established in 1949, several key figures in its educational reform movement had spent time as POWs in the United States. Their influence was subtle but profound. They helped design curricula that emphasized critical thinking, civic responsibility, and open debate, principles learned in those American classrooms. In the countryside, modernized agricultural practices improved productivity, directly reflecting lessons from the U.S. agricultural manuals used in camps like Concordia and McCoy. Across small towns in Bavaria, Hesse, and Lower Saxony, new civic clubs and adult education centers appeared. institutions built in the spirit of the Volkshochschule tradition, but now infused with democratic ideals. The re-education program, once controversial, had become a cornerstone of Germany's moral recovery. Yet for all its success, the story remained largely untold. In post-war Germany, the memory of captivity was often overshadowed by national guilt and silence. Few wanted to speak of the time spent learning from their former enemies. The humility of that experience clashed with the national narrative of reconstruction and sovereignty. It was only decades later, through memoirs and oral histories, that the full picture emerged. Former POWs began writing about their years in America, about the calm voices of their teachers, the smell of chalk and books. The first time they debated without fear, they described how they had learned not just English or mathematics, but a new moral vocabulary. Words like responsibility, freedom, and respect gained meanings that transcended translation. One wrote poignantly in 1972, "We learned democracy not from books, but from behavior. In America, I discovered that decency is not weakness. It is strength in its quietest form." For the United States, the POW education program became a subtle triumph, proof that victory could be measured not only in battlefields won, but in minds changed. It demonstrated that democratic ideals, when practiced with consistency and fairness, could transform even sworn enemies. By 1950, American newspapers occasionally revisited the story, publishing brief articles about former German POWs, now professors, and farmers in the new West Germany. But the scale of what had occurred, the transformation of tens of thousands through education, remained largely absent from popular memory. And yet, its effects persisted in ways history rarely quantifies. In the tone of classrooms rebuilt from rubble, in the calm authority of local teachers, in the dignity of civic meetings held without fear. When historians look back at the post-war decades, they often mark the Marshall Plan as the instrument of Europe's recovery. But long before the first shipment of American goods reached German ports, something deeper had already been exported. An idea, carried not in crates, but in conscience. That idea was born in the classrooms of Camp Concordia, Camp Swift, and dozens of others across America. It was the belief that even in defeat, men could be restored through knowledge. That the mind, once awakened, could not easily be re-enslaved. By the time the last German prisoners left American soil in 1947, the war was over. But the education continued, quietly, invisibly, through every man who had once sat at a wooden desk, surrounded by wire, and learned how to think freely. And as those men built schools, tended crops, raised families, and taught the next generation, the lesson endured, that democracy's greatest strength is not its weapons, but its willingness to teach even its enemies how to be free. The barbed wire had vanished, but what remained were minds unchained. In the years that followed, the story of the German prisoners who studied behind barbed wire faded quietly into history. There were no monuments to commemorate it, no medals, no speeches. Yet in its silence, it carried a meaning far greater than any parade of victory could express. When those men had arrived in America, weary, defeated, and uncertain, they expected punishment. What they found instead was patience, order, and the dignity of education. In the stillness of the Kansas plains, in the dim light of barracks turned into classrooms, they encountered something that totalitarianism could never teach them: the quiet power of trust. The American officers and professors who taught them did not see enemies. They saw students, men capable of reflection, of reason, of change. The lessons they offered were simple: that freedom is a discipline, that respect is a strength, and that the greatest victory in war is not destruction, but understanding. Many of those former prisoners would later describe their time in captivity not as imprisonment, but as awakening. In those moments of study and debate amid fences and guard towers, they discovered that liberty is not merely a right, it is a responsibility, earned daily through thought, compassion, and courage. For the Americans, too, the experiment proved something enduring. That democracy, when practiced honestly, needs no propaganda. It persuades through its behavior, through fairness, decency, and faith in human potential. Decades later, as historians pieced together this forgotten chapter, they found not a story of defeat or triumph, but of transformation, What happened at Camp Concordia, Camp Swift, and hundreds of other places across the American heartland was more than an act of mercy. It was a declaration of principle that even in war, humanity need not surrender. And perhaps that is where the true victory of World War II was written, not in the surrender documents signed aboard battleships, but in the notebooks of men once called enemies who learned, behind fences, what it truly meant to be free. The guns had fallen silent, but in those classrooms the idea of freedom had just begun to speak.